Okay, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be from. I'm very pleased this afternoon. So my name is Shelley, you should say who I am. I'm the director of Bee City Canada. And today's Buzz webinar, we happen to have Lincoln Best here with us. He's from Calgary, but working on this incredible project in Oregon. You can find out about why that is. And he's an expert on native bees, and he'll share with you a bit of his knowledge about the project and about native bees. So make sure you have lots of questions for him. There'll be lots of time for that. So Lincoln, it's all yours.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in Toronto. So here at Oregon State, we have started a really large and ambitious project in collaboration with the Oregon Department of Agriculture called the Oregon Bee Project. So what I'll do during this webinar is give you an introduction to the Oregon Bee Project. And then I'll take a few questions. Then I'll talk about the Oregon Bee Atlas, which is a large-scale biodiversity survey and inventory project that's part of the Oregon Bee Project. And then I'll just show you what I'm up to in the lab and show you a couple bees and, you know, my kind of day-to-day. So a little bit of background on the Oregon Bee Project. About 10 years ago, maybe a little more, we started experiencing significant honeybee die-offs and high winter mortality, often over 50%, which is really devastating for apiculturalists. So what we started to do was survey the public to find out what was needed in order to tackle some of these broad issues. Oregon's a really special case in North America. We have a lot of really good habitat, but we also have a lot of agriculture, and our agriculture in Oregon is very diverse. We have an enormous number of different crop types, especially berries. You know, Oregon's one of the top grass seed producers on the continent, and many other specialty crops, many of which fruits and nuts and so on, which require insect pollination. So these are some of our collaborators, Jim Rivers on the right and Gail Longelato on the left. Jim is here they're both here at OSU. Gail's in horticulture with us, and she works on urban biodiversity, and Jim is over in the College of Forestry working in forest systems. So here you can see the state and how it's broken up with regards to the different agricultural production. In the Willamette Valley, which is highlighted, you can see that we're producing blueberries and strawberries and squash and peach and tons of red clover, lots of hazelnuts, lots of seed crops. It's not just grass seed, but many different seed crops. We have large native plant nurseries producing commercial volumes of native plant seed as well. And if you look around the state, you see all sorts of different things. Oregon's also home to some unique managed pollinators. These are alkali bees, and they nest in specially managed alkali beds by the million. And this is one of the few locations in North America where these bees are managed for pollination services. You don't really find them outside of these systems. So there's many challenges facing bees, from colony collapse disorder, which started, almost 15 years ago now. We have significant bee die-offs due to inappropriate pesticide application on plants in bloom. We have lots of different pests and disease, both in managed and native pollinators. a great example of this is the relationship with Varroa, which is probably the most destructive thing facing honeybees, and the fact that Varroa transmit viruses between colonies and can really wipe out a lot of colonies. And then, of course, we have tons of industrial chemical exposure in agricultural settings. You know, some research in California has found like 100 different industrial chemicals in the wax of honeybee hives used for pollination services. And that is nuts. And then, of course, for our managed species, especially honeybees, we have real issues surrounding nutrition. Because our fields are so large and these bees are foraging often on just a single crop type, often that crop is not providing sufficient nutrition for the bees given the challenges they face. And then on the native bee side, we have thousands of species in North America, many of which have really specialized needs between forage or ecology or habitat. So due to all these crises facing pollinators in the state, there's been government response to that. And so there was a federal response in 2015 related to the honeybee colony losses, which are, you know, it's worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so what they were hoping was that we could reduce honeybee losses to around 15% or less annually, which is it's a really ambitious target, and that we could restore and enhance habitat. And 7 million acres, although it makes up a very, very, very small percentage of the landmass of North America or the US, 7 million acres is a huge undertaking. And so Susan Blaney, who's on here, knows that restoring 1 acre is an incredible amount of work and a very challenging prospect. So we've also got, as part of the federal response, is new pesticide labeling and bringing different stakeholders together in order to try and affect some different management. In the state, we've developed a pollinator health task force, and this includes a broad spectrum of stakeholders on the task force. You can see academics and politicians, the public, master gardeners, beekeepers, conservationists, representatives for food production, and so on. And so in 2015, the state government passed this bill related to pollinator health, and you can see that picture of Adoni Malathopoulos, who had his position. It's a pollinator health professorship developed out of this bill. And so this is really where this whole Oregon Bee Project is coming from, and the Bee Atlas is through state legislation. So this created Adoni's position in horticulture at OSU for the purpose of developing pollinator health outreach and education, which is really multifaceted, communication strategies for education, and so on. So once that happened, that really created a central hub to develop a lot of programming and also to get more grants so that we can actually do things. And so we have been working really hard on outreach and education, developing tons of materials, doing tons of field research, both on managed pollinators, so honeybees, mason bees, alkali bees, and so on, and our native bee biodiversity. We've also developed a bee-friendly farming pilot certification. Along with that, because there's so many different types of land management and land use in the state, we have a lot of incredible collaborators. And so between collaborations in agriculture. Another big one was collaborations in managed forest systems, so that basically the timber industry. And so through the College of Forestry, we have Jim Rivers' lab, who's doing tons of pollinator research in forest systems, primarily in the coastal range, which is west of the Willamette Valley, which is where I am. So as part of the project, we've developed a strategic plan, and this is kind of what it looks like. This is the basic overview. So we want to showcase, we want to engage people, we want to train people. And so training could mean how to apply pesticides responsibly. Could mean training people in bee taxonomy, which is one of the things I do here. Could be training people on how to take care of their honeybees better and developing, as you can see, diagnostic tools and doing research, and so on. So for the showcase, as I mentioned, we have really an incredible diversity of crop types in the state. Alfalfa, cherries, so all sorts of prunus, plums, apricots, and so on. We have tons of seed production and hay. We have cranberries in the Southwest. You know, a lot of these are bee pollinated crops. You can see this is Sarah Kincaid from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and they're a partner on this. Sarah and Adoni developed the Oregon Bee Project collaboratively. So part of the Oregon Bee Project, Engaging Agriculture, is the flagship farm program. And if you look at my little talking head screen, one of the things they've done is to offer tons of different training to these flagship farms, which is an environmental farm program. And that's, as you can see, they established basic standards. They've developed all sorts of education and educational resources. And they've done a preliminary bee monitoring program where they had farmers go out and do some basic sampling on their farms. And so one of my jobs is to identify all the flagship farm bees, which is about 10,000 specimens from, I don't know, maybe 24 farms around the state. And so this is an example of one of these collections. And so these are native bees from agricultural systems. You have a decent diversity of bumblebees and then a variety of other solitary native bees. And it's quite impressive what they've been able to accomplish. And it just helps with education and awareness. And of course, we'll be capturing all this data for the Bee Atlas. We have a lot of incredible leaders and mentors in that project. And this is Michael O'Loughlin, and between him and his brother, they're involved in really promoting environmental land management in agricultural land use situations. And so Michael and Dan own a large grass seed production farm in McMinnville, which is in Yamhill County, southwest of Portland. And they sit on all these advisory committees and take part in the Bee Atlas and in the flagship farm program. So if you know people like this, you should really help promote them. The amount of engagement has been just absolutely incredible. And so between educating people on how to use pesticides and developing new protocols for labeling standards, this is Matthew here. He wrote a paper, which I don't have the citation with me. It's a review of the different pesticide labels for retail products available in the state of Oregon. And what we found was that they're not very standardized. And additionally, they're incredibly difficult for people to understand what the labels are really saying. You know, how toxic are these things, when you should apply them, when you shouldn't apply them. And so there was a big need for developing standardized labeling for these different products. as you can see here, there's very little difference in the product, but the labels could be completely different. There's too much flexibility in how you market these things. And so part of this was to provide education related to pesticide application. So we have tons of resources available. I encourage everyone to go and check out the Oregon Bee Project website. It's extensive. There are all sorts of resources there. If you're interested in native bees, go check out the Oregon Bee Atlas component. There's all sorts of resources, from presentations you can use to lists of different resources for doing bee taxonomy. Like, it's a full spectrum of things. There's been a ton of outreach. Adoni's doing events every week almost, as well as there's all sorts of other people working on the project that tour the state, doing various kinds of outreach. So running tables at every event you could think of, at the zoo event, at the farmers market, running training courses all over the state. It's really impressive. There's tons of different posters and postcards and pamphlets and booklets that have been developed on a broad spectrum of topics, from, as you can see here, native bee diversity to pesticide use and so on. So we do outreach related to bee biodiversity through the Atlas as well. So feel free to check out the Facebook page as well. You'll see tons of updates related to the project, and a lot of high quality information will get posted there, coming from all sorts of different sources. We have a series, Adoni's been running a series of podcasts. I don't know how many episodes there are now, but all your greatest bee heroes are on the podcast. So if you haven't listened to the Pollination podcast, definitely check it out. Just on this page, you can see Al Shea, who's a native plant horticulturalist. The guy is a serious brain. He knows all sorts of stuff. Laura Taylor in the middle there is a citizen science outreach educator. You see Jim Rivers, who's working in forestry. I'm episode 50, so check it out. You can hear me talk about, I don't know, I think my manifesto is on there. So with respect to training, there's been a lot of training, and this has been going on for 4 years now. Training agriculturalists, primarily through the Bee Health Initiative, training the public and hundreds of Bee Atlas volunteers on bee biodiversity. I run the Oregon Bee School annually in July at Oregon State. It's a 5-day lab-based taxonomy course. It's all you've ever wanted to know about native bee biodiversity and bee identification, and probably a lot more. It is open to the public. So if you want to travel to Oregon and learn all about the bees and be surrounded by really incredible people, come down to Corvallis for 5 days in July. So here in horticulture, it's not just the pollinator health professorship that Adoni has with the Oregon Bee Project, but also Ramesh Sigili is here with the OSU Honeybee Lab, and he has a large team, and they have set up probably one of the most high-tech diagnostics labs, at least in Western North America, with respect to honeybees. So they can do all sorts of different diagnostics for disease in honeybees to support the significant commercial honeybee industry. And the research coming out of there is really, really impressive. I was fortunate to get a tour, excuse me, from Priya, one of his postdocs, a few weeks ago. And they have this setup where she opens the honeybee's brain and then engages it with these microelectrodes to study honeybee like neurobiology and physiology. It's intense. And then, of course, it's really important because before these positions were created or the project was started, we didn't have really any baseline data. And that's for a lot of things. We didn't know, with respect to the commercial beekeeping industry, what are the losses year on year. There was a little bit of reporting, but it wasn't comprehensive. And so really, if you want to know, are honeybee die-offs getting worse, you need really comprehensive reporting on the majority of honeybee colonies in the state. And so the Oregon Bee Project is working with commercial apiculturalists who do provide pollination services over a wide distance, and especially out of state in California. And I'm sure everyone has likely heard about the situation in almond production down there. It's a significant case. So you can see here some apiculturalists inspecting lost hives over the winter. The main culprit still is, I think, Varroa. That's the most significant problem in apiculture. And so really, this is a Varroa monitoring for the most part. And of course, Varroa do transmit a lot of these viruses. So they've set up a committee for the project. Again, this committee has a broad spectrum of stakeholders. We've set up through the Atlas, we have regional coordinators. One thing that's, as a Canadian, that has really impressed me here is Oregon State University has a extension service all over the state, and the extension service is state funded. And that is a really incredible model. In Canada, we used to have a lot of these small, rural research centers and a lot more rural outreach. But in the 90s, most of those things were shuttered. And now we just have our kind of primary federal institutions, and there's not a ton of outreach. So just in the state of Oregon, I couldn't believe how many extension service agents there are. And I think that's something that we really need north of the border. I would say probably all of our provinces could use a system like that, because it just provides the mechanism to be able to do this kind of outreach. So does anyone have any questions related to the Oregon Bee Project at the moment? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Oh, well.
I do.
Okay, go ahead, Elaine.
I was wondering about that Varroa mite. You said that it transmits viruses. Are the viruses transmitted to native bees also?
So Varroa is specific to honeybees.
Okay.
Although people have documented them on native bees, but they don't appear to be a significant pest of native bee nests, likely because they're specialized on the colonial nature of honeybees, the fact that honeybees live in this big colony. Our native bees don't really live in a big colony. And then the other thing is that honeybee colonies can persist for, a few years. A good producing queen in a healthy colony can persist for multiple years, whereas we don't have native bees that are colonial where that specific colony will persist for year on year. And so it doesn't appear as though they're a significant pest of native bees, but there's likely other methods of transmission of various pathogens. Anyone else?
Yeah, so can you share a little bit about the native bees that because you've looked at all of them. So how many thousands have you looked at, Lincoln?
So I'll talk a little bit about the bee atlas specifically, and then I'll give you a little tour and point boxes of bees at you and give you some little tidbits on what I've been working over the last few weeks.
All right, so just basically questions about the project itself.
Yeah, so the Oregon Bee Project has kind of two primary components. One is managed pollinator health, and so that's honeybees, blue orchard mason bees, and maybe one or two other species of commercially managed bees like alfalfa leafcutter bees and also the alkali bees, but mostly focused on honeybees for obvious reasons. The other side of the Oregon Bee Project is the Oregon Bee Atlas. And the Oregon Bee Atlas is an initiative to know more about native bee biodiversity and their status in the state. So why a bee atlas? Well, this is from a publication from 1969 where Bill Stevens, who was actually in Ottawa and wrote the monograph on Calides many years ago. So Bill Bohart and Vincent Torchio provided this list on the northwestern bee fauna, and they estimated about 879 species that would occur in the Northwest. That's an estimate. That's a lot of species. You can see there, if you look on the right side, that the estimate for osmia alone is 75 species of osmia. So osmia are mason bees, and 75 species is just incredible diversity. And so the reason we need to study the native bees is because we don't really know very much about them. If there's that many species, well, we don't know how many species occur in the state. We don't know often what they do or where they live. Something that I've found in reviewing the state fauna is that lots of these species are known only from one or two specimens ever. And so if we want to talk about potential declines, loss of species, changes in their distribution or range, we need a lot stronger baseline. And that's something we really don't have. So part of my responsibilities here at OSU are, and through the Oregon Bee Atlas and project, are to curate the historical specimens that are housed in the Oregon State Arthropod Collection, which is in the building next door to me. And they have bees going back over 100 years from Western North America, which is about as old as things get out here. And so we've been working on curating initially the bombus, so all the bumblebees, and the family Megachelidae. So I'll try not to get too far off track here. So this is from a paper published by bee experts from all around the world in response to pollinator declines. And so what they found in this table was, this is kind of a power analysis. So trying to figure out like how much sampling do you need to do in order to detect a potential decline. And so what they're showing is to detect a really severe decline, obviously you do less sampling and that's cheaper. But to detect small declines, you need either to, essentially you need to sample many sites more intensively. And so ultimately detecting declines in native bee populations is really challenging, especially when you're dealing with potentially several hundred species. And so what we did was, of course, we developed the Oregon Bee Atlas. The Oregon Bee Atlas has regional groups. where's the picture here? Oh, I don't know where it is. So we have regional groups set up all over the state, and these are volunteer-based. Some of the groups are led up by our extension agents. So for example, in Bend, we have Tony Stephen, and I think in Grants Pass, we have Nicole Sanchez. They're both OSU extension agents. And so we go out and we train these regional groups, and they do surveying for us. And so we have almost 200 people that have been surveying bees in the state. I won't go into all the technicalities on how it's done. We're using iNaturalist and a bunch of different things to harvest all the data. But ultimately, we train them on sampling methods. We provide them with all the equipment. We give them training in taxonomy through the Oregon Bee School and through regional training sessions. So we've had training sessions all over the state several times. And these people go out and they sample off particular flowers, record the flower data, and then pin up their catches and label up their catches with all the scientific little data labels. This gets made into a database, and then at the end of the year, they send all their bees in to get identified by me. So I'm the bottleneck on the project, and we're just coming to the end of our first cycle. So this is the basic cycle. We have all of our citizen scientists. They're trained up. They go out and survey. They work in their groups to prepare their specimens and to label everything and to do their best job identifying the bees as best they can. And actually, people have done quite a good job. They've received a fair amount of training, but most of our volunteers can identify bees quite well to the generic level. And then, so I'm basically step 5, and I'll put species names on as many of these 20,000 specimens from 2018, as many as I can. And so most of our short-term goals have been reached. We have a huge number of really dedicated volunteers throughout the state. They're doing an incredible job sampling. All the really technical parts of this have worked out quite well. So we are collecting really high quality biodiversity data, which will get published towards the end of this year. These regional groups are becoming real hubs of knowledge. The whole thing has just been incredible. So you can see where some of our groups are on this map. We've actually added more groups in Eastern Oregon and another group on the Southwest coast. And so we have quite good coverage throughout the state. And then as well, we have maybe a dozen people that are retired, and a lot of them are retired professionals that, were wildlife biologists or entomologists. And they actually, like I love to do, go out and tour the state and go to some of these more remote locations. And they've turned in absolutely incredible material. So we also work with these groups to provide them with education and outreach materials. So display collections, reference material, and so on. You can see some of the material produced by the Petersons. These are all prepared in the kind of traditional European style, like butterflies with the wings out and everything. And you can see in the one box a nice series of Bombus morrisoni, which has been recently rediscovered for Canada in the Kootenays in British Columbia. And of course, we do tons of tabling and outreach events with the Atlas, and people love it. So our long-term goals is for the Oregon Bee Atlas to kind of stand on its own feet. Right now, we're being supported through federal agriculture grant, which is a 4-year term. But we would like, one, our regional groups to become more independent, which they're, even after just 1 year, a lot of them really are fully capable now of running their own biodiversity survey projects. And we're getting a lot of requests from different state agencies, national forests, different land management groups, for our actual volunteers now to go out and do projects for them where they will survey, like I said, different state forest or Bureau of Land Management properties or different preserves or restoration areas and so on. And we would like to be able to maybe standardize some level of taxonomic expertise. So one of the reasons for that is that right now I'm the bottleneck. So all the bees come to me. I have to identify these mountains of specimens. And so I'm a real bottleneck on the production of biodiversity data in the project. So we're getting people able to at least handle different groups like bumblebees or sweat bees and so on in order to kind of tackle that taxonomic burden. And so I encourage everyone to look out for our promotional posters regarding the Oregon Bee School. It'll be in July. We'll likely host it for 2 sessions in the middle 2 weeks of July. And if you want to see what's going on down here, learn all about native bee biodiversity, come down. It's awesome. We have really incredible pollinator gardens on campus that host like crazy diversity. And so, you can just go out on lunch and sit on a bench surrounded by all these native plantings and just watch all these crazy bees flying around. So I think that's it for the slideshow. And I'll just gonna, can you guys see me full screen right now?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'll show you is just give you a little brief tour of like what I've been working on with the Oregon Bee Atlas. Last year I was primarily working in the Oregon State Arthropod collection. So right behind me, over my shoulder, are about 20,000 specimens. So in those drawers, in all these SMIT boxes, and in those drawers. And these are all specimens that were turned in by our volunteers from around the state. And so one thing I've done so far, because I've been working on this for a couple weeks now, is I've curated all the bumblebees. Our volunteers discovered 2 new bumblebee species for the state. So they're not new species, but they're newly recorded bumblebees for Oregon. So you can see all these different bumblebees. And so once I finished the bumblebees, I started working through the mason bees. And so far I've identified 35 species of mason bees for the state. And to just give you a few examples, we have Osmia, melanopleura, inurbana, Phacelia, Cara, Coloradensis, Nemoris, Tersata, Lignaria, Integra, Bruneri, Aglia, Calla, Ribiflorus, Cyanella, Montana, Kincaidi, Exigua, and so on. Dozens of mason bee species, and I think there's about 15 more. So I think our volunteers collected almost 50 species of mason bees this year. And I'm not sure how well this will show up, but how's the color reproduction on that? Do they look purple and green and shiny?
Not all.
Not really. They look little and black. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, it's tough.
They look better in the flowers buzzing around.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I'm surrounded by bug sarcophagi. And so, our volunteers have found genera of bees in the state that were previously known from like 2 specimens. So we've expanded the range of entire genera significantly by often hundreds and hundreds of miles. Our volunteers have found species of bees that are previously known from, let's see, the one hoplitis was known, I think, from 3 specimens. So a bee that's only ever been found 3 times, our volunteers have been able to rediscover this. And so that's really, really impressive, I think. And this is, of course, just the first cycle. So we have at least 3 more years of this. We've been doing all sorts of more training this spring, getting people ready, and they love it. And so people are planning all these field trips all over the state. We'll be hosting a field course at the Siskiyou Field Institute this May. I think that's about it.
Okay. Thank you, Link. That's quite the project. So there's some questions that have been typed in. So Susan Blaney asks, is there any conflict between native bee conservation and honey beekeeping?
Yeah, there's a lot of conflict. I mean, you can read about this narrative in the media. And as the honeybee industry expands, which it has been, there's more and more competition for floral resources. Even among beekeepers themselves, finding places in the mountains that you can put hundreds of hives in to keep your bees going. So we might be approaching our capacity for how many honeybees we can support. There's all sorts of things related to this, and I'm not an expert on honeybees, although I did talk about honeybees a fair amount. And so the real question is are honeybees having a significant negative impact on native bee species? And there is a fair amount of literature on this, so I encourage you to look into that. I don't like to pit the honeybee people against the native bee people. I try to be a little more diplomatic. And so what I'll say is all the bees compete for very similar resources. There are significant concerns about the transmission of pathogens between managed species and native species. And that this is just one of many land use issues that we're struggling to manage. And so in order to, I think, manage these issues as effectively as we can, I don't think it's useful to pit people against one another like that, but to work together to find solutions. We're never going to just shut down business. So we need to find ways to manage these things well. And I personally don't have really good solutions for that because land use management is such an incredible challenge. And I think it really is the greatest challenge that we have moving forward.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you for that. That was great. That was a great answer.
You're welcome.
Okay, there is another question that was typed in from Genevieve Rose. She says, can you talk a bit about how you recruit and engage your volunteers, participants for each regional group? What have you tried? What has worked best? And what strategies have you used for future initiative years?
So I think in Oregon, we're really lucky in that people that live in Oregon often have a very progressive mindset with respect to the environment. And so it's a really great place to initiate a project like this. So that's part of it, is that you have communities that are kind of already into this. We have a really well-established master gardener community. We have master naturalist programming. And so we just had a great opportunity, I think, as part of it. And the way we set it up was just through, your typical streams of promotion. But, initially, like the reason that the state legislated the pollinator health professorship and created all of this is through public demand. Mm-hmm. And so the public, they were already there demanding that something be done due to honeybee die-offs and then some like highly publicized native bee die-offs due potentially to like inappropriate pesticide application and so on. And so the scene was already set and the public was already behind it. And so when the atlas was starting to be developed, there was already a lot of public awareness around these issues. And so people were they were all ready to be engaged.
Great. Thanks. I think that answers the question. So let me ask you something about looking at a little north of the border where you are in Canada. Is something like what you're doing in Oregon, is that a possibility here in Canada? Has anybody approached you about that?
There have been some projects that were kind of similar to this. I mean, through CanPollen, the Canadian Pollination Initiative, there were kind of attempts made to do transnational sampling. It wasn't super successful. There wasn't a ton of material that was produced out of it. As well as there wasn't a lot of education and outreach, and it didn't rely on volunteers. It was all kind of academic. I think the big difference is, and I mentioned this earlier, talking about the Oregon Bee Project, is that our extension service here is invaluable. It is so important for a lot of these initiatives, and not just our Bee Atlas or Bee Project initiative, but they do a lot of other things as well. You know, they're their local or regional community representative. And without those people, a lot of this wouldn't be possible. And so if I was to make any changes to how things are done in Canada, I would lobby the government provincially and regionally to set up an extension service for outreach, because our government and our federally and provincially, we're not engaging with the public effectively. We're not organizing them. We're not providing them with the resources they need. There's still a huge separation. And so that extension service really fills that role between the government and the public. And so I think that's just a critical part of this. It's, you know, it's the linchpin for a lot of what's happening here, is the fact that we have the extension service.
So there's a question from David. Ms. Felt from Calgary. Is there a chance to recreate more habitat where you found the rarest bees? Do you know what kind of flora they like? What kind of habitat they nest in? Let's see, where you find, maybe where you could find the bee samples, especially the rare ones?
So there's no single answer to that when you're talking about rare or uncommon bee species, because they're all different and they're often all rare for different reasons. Some of them are really isolated in where they live. So maybe the species only occurs on one mountain. But each case is different. And so that's a challenge. Some bees are widespread, but they exist or appear to exist at very low population levels, which makes their detection really difficult. So some rare species, if you know the mountain they live on, you can go there at the right time of year and see them, and there might be lots, but they don't live anywhere else. Whereas other species, they might live all over the place, but the abundance is exceptionally low. And so how do you monitor for something like that? Ultimately, you need to produce a lot of specimens in order to like find one of these things that exists at really low populations. There's no simple answer, but I think, you know, what you're doing in the city of Calgary is great. Ultimately, I think the one primary thing we can do is conserve habitat. So some of these, you know, more native ecosystems or more wild places need conservation. And then for all of our impacted lands, which there's lots of, to restore it where possible, or to integrate management solutions that will allow biodiversity to persist in intensively used lands. And so, for example, Alberta, we have some of the largest agricultural fields on Earth. What can we do to enhance biodiversities in those settings? Well, we can plant pollinator mixes on the roadsides or in those little areas that aren't under the management. And so I think those are basic solutions.
Great. So let me ask you a question about collection of species and samples and and how you pin all of them, and you have thousands and thousands. Is technology sort of catching up with a way that could make it a little bit easier, maybe with photographs or something, or cameras, little cameras that maybe you don't have to collect the samples, that you could just leave them? Is that coming?
Some of that's here. So there's a couple different kinds of citizen science projects that people can take part in right now that doesn't require lethal sampling. The real big one is iNaturalist. You upload a photo and the location and the date to iNaturalist, and you can try and guess at what critter or plant or whatever it is that's in your photo, and you can apply the name, and it'll get checked by an expert at some point. Or you can just upload it and say, it's a bee, I think, it's a bug at least. And people, experts from all over the world, are curating these images that have the geographic or spatial data, as well as the temporal data associated with them. And so check out iNaturalist, and you can go to the bumblebee section and see all the bumblebee photos people have contributed and how that becomes an actual biodiversity species occurrence data point. Otherwise, you can take part in specific projects, such as Bumblebee Watch is a bee-related citizen science project that's run through Xerxes. And again, it's using the example bumblebees. You take a photo, you upload the photo, you tell them where and when it's from, and then you can try and guess at what bumblebee you took a picture of. And ultimately, some bumblebee experts will put a name on it for you and tell you if you're right or wrong. And that data gets, collated and is used by researchers. The Oregon Bee Project and Atlas has received funding for obviously our atlas, but also we have partnered with Xerxes Society on the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is a special project within Bumblebee Watch. And ultimately it's a similar protocol to Bumblebee Watch. It's just a little bit more intensive. And so the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas cuts the Pacific Northwest region up into a series of grids. And then what you would do is you go out, you choose one of these grids. So you drive out, hopefully into Eastern Washington, and you go out, you catch bumblebees and pop them in a vial. And then take multiple photos of each specimen in a vial, still alive, document it really well, and then you let it go. So it's like catch, photo, release, and you survey the bumblebees for, I think, 45 minutes, and hopefully catch a whole bunch and get a bunch of data points. And then that provides a little extra data on top of the usual, like, I saw this bumblebee in this place. It gives a comparative measure across all the grid cells for what the community compositions are throughout the regions. And so I encourage people that, if you're in my region here, to take part in the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas through Xerxes, or to take part in the in Bumblebee Watch, which is North America wide. And they're producing thousands of data points every year, which is impressive and really high quality data. Aside from programs like that, the challenge we have is that most bees aren't bumblebees. And so, when I show you these little boxes, we still have many species of bees that can't even be identified. We have new species, whole genera that require revision that haven't been revised in 7 decades. And so the identification of these things requires microscopy. So I spend 4 to 6 hours a day on the microscope because there's no other way. In the future, we might have some alternatives. We might be able to just maybe clip a bee's toe off and sequence it to get the identification. These kinds of ideas have been passed around for a while now, but ultimately it's not particularly cost effective. And so if we want to know about all these small, incredibly diverse species, it's still like 100 years ago when we studied birds with shotguns. That's what it's like. And so, but ultimately, bees live in much larger populations. And so when we go into an area, we're catching, even if we catch 1,000 bees, it might represent 150 species, which could be 7 specimens of each species. And so it seems like a lot, but compared to what's out there, it's almost immeasurable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. David has another question. It says, what kind of expert web and information services do we have in Canada for the public?
That's a good question. The City of Toronto has done a really good job. I think they're really kind of leading as a municipality, providing information and outreach. We have some NGOs in Canada, like Pollinator Partnership now, who's developing a series of eco-regional planting guides for native plants related to how they support biodiversity, focusing on, I think, like birds and butterflies and bees as much as possible. But most of the information is very academic. I mean, you can follow my Instagram at Bees of Canada, and I post tidbits about different native species and a lot of botanical stuff. But again, we don't have a real dedicated service like our extension service here in Oregon that does that kind of outreach and that develops those specific materials. And so if you're looking for information, go to the usual sources. I would suggest go to the scientific literature where a lot of the nitty details are. You can go to our website for the Oregon Bee Project. There's tons of material there. You can check out Xerxes. They have series of books as well as different outreach materials and citizen science projects. And so at this point, there's lots of information out there if you look for it. There's no shortage.
Okay, thanks. So does anyone have anyone like to unmute themselves or ask some questions, maybe just about native bees in general? We've got an expert here. Let's take advantage. Any questions? Okay. So let me just ask you something about native bees. Now, I know they're specialists, but let's say a generalist bee. How many, I'm sure it's hard to answer because all bees are different, but they would forage at they need a lot of different species, correct? Of plants, native plants, to stay healthy.
Potentially, but a lot of things I like to think that every bee is specialized.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Some bees are specialized to forage just on one or a few different host plants. But even our generalist bees are specialized for general foraging. And so that means some plants they can't visit because they don't have the long tongue that might be necessary to reach the nectaries. And so they limit themselves too. And so there's always a trade-off. Whether you're specialized on one plant or if you're specialized for being a general forager. And so these things are also specialized temporally. So, you're often, if you're a solitary bee, you're a spring bee, an early summer bee, or a late summer bee. and you're only active during that period of time. So for example, right now we have a lot of spring mason bees and spring mining bees coming out, and they're only going to be active for a month. So their, plant selection is limited to spring flora. Some of them are specialized and some of them are generalized. And so the generalists often will have a very strong preference for forage. And that might be willow, or it might be other woody shrubs, especially in the spring. So things like the genus Prunus, which would be choke cherries, pin cherries, and things like that. And you'll often find that these species, even if they are more generalist foragers, will have often very strong preferences locally. So the local population will be primarily on the choke cherry, but maybe on dandelions a bit, or that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. I've read too that that bees like to go into forests or close to forest or logs. Maybe they pick up fungus from there. Is that something you've researched or know something about?
I don't know specifically what you're referring to, but we do have bees that will nest in forest edges, especially. So in southern Ontario, you have little tiny green sweat bees that will nest under the bark often of fallen trees. So deadfall, they'll nest wherever there's a crack in the bark, they'll go in it and then go right under and then make a little nest as if it was the ground. And they'll nest like that. Some bees will visit large kind of mushroom bodies, especially if you have, say, a log that's full of white or brown rot, and there's a huge amount of fungus tissue in this log. That fungus tissue exudes liquid, and that's all their kind of secondary metabolites. And that liquid has all sorts of stuff in it. Often it has like antibacterial, antiviral, as well as potentially carbohydrates and different things. And so bees are often seen visiting like piles of sawdust. It's like, why are all these bees visiting the sawdust? And it's, well, because it's full of fungus and they're giving off this liquid that has minerals and all these different things in it that the bees want.
So basically it's a big pharmacy out there, and they go, not a pharmacy, but a big shopping mall out there, and they go take what they need depending on the situation. So biodiversity is critical. Yeah. So what would you say to cities, are the bee cities, in terms of what they should be considering for native bees when they're thinking about the parks? How could they change them, or what can they do?
So it's funny, this webinar, I've been talking about the extension service so much. Mm-hmm. Bee City Canada is filling that role, right? Doing education and outreach. It's kind of a significant part of the enterprise, is being that liaison for communities. So, what people can do is plant native plants. Everyone has kind of a different capacity. So we see hundreds of these projects now, which is pollinator gardens and pollinator restoration projects and different things like that. They're conducted by an incredible spectrum of people, from like school kids, like elementary school kids, like little kids literally getting their hand in the soil and planting milkweed or planting native shrubs or whatever it is. And so not everyone has the same capacity to maybe have the most academically informed plant selections, but I wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't stress too much about that. I certainly have all my preferences, but the fact that these projects are happening, it's primarily important for education and providing cultural value. So having the environment as a cultural value, and also creating that kind of source of inspiration for that is maybe the most important thing. And maybe secondarily is like actually kind of providing habitat for these critters. Because if we don't have communities that value these things, we're never going to get anywhere. So.
Right, thanks. So there's a question from Julianne. She says, are mason bee houses helpful for the urban gardener, or are they just a commercial gimmick? And are urban gardeners best to plant a mixture of native and non-native plants? And what are your preferences for plants? I'd be curious to know.
Yeah, so I always advise people to plant native plants. I'm not against non-native plants. They're part of our landscape now. Even if you go into wild places, there's non-native species. And we're not going to get rid of them, regardless of how many teams of university students we send out to dig up whichever invasive plant it is. Like, they're not going anywhere. So I don't worry about native versus non-native. Native is definitely a preference. They're also more expensive. They can be harder to source, and so on. I have a lot of preferences, but generally, if you want to support a large suite of native bee species, you want, everybody write this down, a sunflower.
Writing it down. Sunflower.
And a small flowered pea family plant. So something in the Fabaceae with small flowers. So things like a vetch or a lotus or things like that. But it varies by region. And then I also, especially in the West, things in the family Boraginaceae are super important. So if you're in the West, Phacelia is probably my favorite. But we also have some really interesting other genera in the Boraginaceae, including Cryptantha. And these things attract an incredible diversity of species and really weird stuff.
Okay.
And that's the short list. It's, one borage, one sunflower, one pea.
Well, that's a good start anyway, and certainly have
Yeah.
lots of those early spring flowers and late fall.
Yeah, I think also that woody shrubs really get overlooked, and they're super important. So things like, there's so many actually, between willows and prunus, things like hawthorn. In the West, ceanothus is super important. And then, of course, we have all the huckleberries, and there's all sorts of woody shrubs, and they're all, currants like the ribes. They're all super good.
Okay, so as I said, any last questions here? We just gone over the hour, so we'll wrap it up. So, anyone? Well, thank you so much, Lincoln. It's been really interesting. And I should tell you that Lincoln's also on the board of Bee City Canada, so we're really thrilled to have him at his expertise and his great smile as well. So with that, I will send out a recording, and maybe Lincoln, if you could forward to me some links about the project, and so other people can then have able access to all that information as well.
All right.
All right, so have a good day, everyone. Oh yeah, let me remind you that on April 9th, we have our next speaker is Dr. Phil Gregory from UBC. And his talk is on the magic of soil. It's not the magic of mushrooms, but the magic of soil. And I think once you hear his talk, I think it'll really open our eyes to what's possible. And when we create healthy soil, and we really think about life of the soil, we can eliminate a lot of our pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, fertilizer, all that stuff, and really create healthy plants, a lot of biodiversity, and of course that's better for the bees. So please join us on April the 9th for that. Okay, All right, with that, thank you so much again, and have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.